Hi, folks, and welcome to another edition of Government Matters. My name is Mike Dobbs. I'm your host here on Focus Springfield. And we got a special edition, 2 guests, and we're going to explain everything to you about the last election. Everything. We're going to be here for 6 or 8 hours, obviously, because a lot happened in this election. It really did. So we have Carrie Saldo, who is the host of The Rundown on NEPM every week, and Anthony Cignoli, well-known political consultant. And thank you so much for coming on, both of you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the idea of our discussion, as I said to both of you in our telephone conversations, is we're going to do micro to macro. And so we're going to start looking at stuff in Western Massachusetts, basically. We had a plethora of incumbent state reps who eased right into office because there was no one challenging them. But we did have a couple state rep races I want to start off with. And Carrie, you know, you're a Berkshire County person much more than I am, so you understand this. We had a open race for the 3rd Berkshire state rep seat.
Smitty Pignatelli was tired of driving from the Berkshires to Boston.
There it is.
He was there for over 20 years, and he decided, you know, he had served his time in the state legislature, so it was an open race. There was a primary. Mary Beth Mitz ran as an incumbent, so she came through to the general election. Lee Davis, the Democrat, came out of the primary race, and Lee Davis, it was a tight race. They were both running on some similar challenges they saw in the Berkshires, chief among them the economy and housing, not unfamiliar to other challenges we're hearing across here in Western Massachusetts and the country. For her part, Lee Davis came out the victor in the race. She had the support of the current legislative delegation. I also believe she was endorsed by some statewide figures, including Governor Healy. I don't know if I have that entirely correct. Tony, you might remember. Lee Davis, the victor there, representing.
Was this a surprise?
I don't believe it was necessarily a surprise. I think Mary Beth Mitz ran a good race, and running as the unenrolled individual is always going to be a harder road to toe than someone who is running as an establishment Democrat or Republican candidate. But I think it was a competitive race. They both ran good, clean races, both committed to the issues, but I don't necessarily think it was a surprise. Tony?
No, not at all, yeah. What was great about it is that it was a good race, as you say. They actually talked about stuff. There was a good discourse. If you lived in the district, you had a general idea, even more so, about what was important, what wasn't, what the hot issues were going to be. It was a good learning discourse for a lot of people. They all should be proud that ran. They did a great job.
And both women coming from select boards in their respective communities, Lenox for Mary Beth Mitz and Great Barrington for Lee Davis. So they sort of cut their teeth at the lower legislative or the lower level of elected office, and then trying to work their way up for both candidates to the state representative position. I think it'll be interesting to watch. As I said, they both had political experience, but we're losing an incumbent with 20 years of experience. So there's going to be a bit of a learning curve, even though she's been brought into the fold by these other legislators. And I'm sure the Berkshire delegation has always been one to work together. You kind of have to in a small community like that. So I'm sure they'll take her under their wing and help her sort of learn the ropes. And we'll see where this goes. Smitty Pignatelli, obviously there to lean on if she needs it, I'm sure.
Well, the other race that we had in the area, and please correct me if I'm wrong if I forget one, was in Westfield. Right. Kelly Pease, the incumbent state rep, was being challenged by Bridget Matthews-Kane, who is one of the city councilors. And in a town like Westfield, he won by 3,000 votes. So that's pretty definitive in terms of a win. Did that surprise either of you, that a Republican wins in Westfield?
Not that he retained the seat coming out of Westfield, but the votes out of Southampton. The thoughts from folks at the Democratic State Committee and others was that this is a Democratic town and that there's an opportunity here. And there have been some concern from some Republicans that, wow, with this new redistricting, and this being the first time that that legislator was challenged after redistricting, that this could be a problem. Bridget Matthews-Kane ran a great campaign. It was really grassroots, a ton of door knocking, did all the right things, outraised her opponent better than 2-1. But I think this says something. And we can look at 1980, we go back that far. Reagan Revolution did what to the Massachusetts legislature and Senate? It brought a lot of Republicans in, which was amazing, into Democratic areas. And if you look right now at Hamden County, at long, generationally blue communities, cities and towns, like West Springfield, that went heavy red this time around. That's what happened in that district to a great degree too, because that number, that 3,000, that's what did surprise me. And it was a lot of folks that were voting from Trump on down. I'm going to be on the Republican side, and I'm going to send a message.
He spoke at the Neil press conference about East-West Rail. Yeah. I was there because I'm going to write a column about it. And at the end of his remarks, and he was the last one to do the remarks, he said, you know, we got an election coming up and half the country is going to be very disappointed. However this is going to work. And I just want to remind people that I want to work with everybody. It was a nicely conciliatory kind of statement to make, especially since he was surrounded by Democrats. Yeah. And it was also sort of not the kind of rhetoric that I'd been hearing from Republican candidates. So I don't know the guy personally by any means, but Westfield has long been a Republican stronghold here. Yeah.
Well, I also believe this is his third term in office, yeah, right? Yeah. And he worked under Don Humison, longtime Republican, well-known in the region, still in government, running a town manager position now. So certainly knows the road based on that. I think Matthews-Kane, she was speaking in the run-up to the election about being a Democrat and how, as Tony was saying, that this could be perhaps an advantage for her. And perhaps in another 4 years, 2-year cycle, we might see that. Yeah. This was not that. Yeah. This was not the race for a D to be something that is perhaps automatically something that you can count on here in historically blue Massachusetts. Her statement probably would have won the day in another cycle, but this just wasn't the one.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. You know, one other surprise, if I could mention, to your question of surprises, Dan Carey, longtime state representative, decides not to run for re-election to the House, runs instead for probate registrar, and so the seat's open. A House seat is open. No one runs. One person gets into the race, Omar Gomez from East Hampton, and he wins. And to his credit, good, he ran, but I think that says something too. When you take a look at how many House and Senate seats in this cycle in Massachusetts were unchallenged, that's incredible. I mean, is it that no one wants to do the job? Is it there's a thought that the incumbents are too difficult to beat? And it can be expensive to take on an incumbent, especially if that incumbent is, you know, well entrenched and has got the party chops, so to speak, and connections. But that's fascinating to me. There was a time, and I date myself with this, when I first got involved, I mean, an open House seat, you'd have 6, 7, 8 people running, you know? And it is astonishing that we're just not seeing anybody with that real interest anymore. And it's not like the jobs pay the way they used to. It's a pretty good paying job now, especially when you take a look at the amount of time that you do go back and forth to Boston. There's exceptions to that. Exactly. You get a per diem for it, you get office expenses, etc. It's not a bad gig, not a bad gig.
And among the contested races, they were not particularly snazzy.
No.
There wasn't a ton to write home about these, you know, and trying to talk about them in a way that's fair and helping to inform the electorate. I sometimes found myself struggling to find something much of anything to say about some of the challengers.
I was surprised too that in a legislative cycle where very little got done, where the legislators themselves were complaining about we didn't pass an economic development bill. Can you believe it?
Yeah.
Or this or that, because there's a beef between the House and the Senate leadership. And in a year, this year, where Boston media especially, Boston Globe, Herald always probably on this one, hammering the legislature, Boston Business Journal, pointing out, here's what this costs, that nothing's getting done. Holy smokes. And then the Globe doing that series on leadership in the legislature. It reminded me back in the 80s when the Globe put a spotlight team on the House, and they called it Power and Privilege. It ultimately changed everything. It dethroned a House Speaker, all committee chairs, etc. But basically in that piece, they talk about the largesse of leadership and the benefits. We'll like this one. You know, one of the legislators on his OCPF, on his filings, at a cigar bar with friends, paying for the campaign, $3,500 or $3,800 tab, $85 cigars. Your campaign contributors gave you that money, not for that.
Literally up in smoke.
I love it. There you go, up in smoke. There it is. I love it. I love it. But I mean, all that was out there, heavy in the Boston area, no big challenges, no primal scream. And unlike the 80s when the Globe first hit the same topics, no hue and cry, no screaming from the electorate to say, what the heck is this?
Interesting then, we saw, and I think we'll talk about the ballot questions coming up, right? So I don't want to talk about this too much now, but Q1, the question one on whether the legislature should be audited, we saw 71% approval on that question. So people are interested in whether or not legislators are doing what they say they're going to do, or whether, regardless of whether they're aware of maybe the nitty-gritty of what the question's going to get into, I think that shows some distrust among the electorate.
And I think part of that, my guess is they understand that not much was done in this legislative session. We had a lot of discussion about whether or not they were going to come back in a special session to do stuff with the economic development stuff. And maybe there were enough voters paying attention to that to said, well, wait a minute, should we have some sort of checks and balances on the legislature, on the general court, about what they're doing or not doing? So this is, and we'll talk about this when we get to our macro. But to me, it's like, this is going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, how she actually uses this, and whether or not the House even cooperates with it in the long run. So this is going to be very interesting. All right. So Congressman Neal, Nadia Millerin, 62.5% for Neal, Millerin 37.5% according to the Associated Press. She stated here on Focus Springfield, and she told various other news outlets that she intends to run again in 2 years. And you know, sometimes that's a case of a little being brave for the cameras. But then when she said it after her defeat, I'm thinking, well, maybe she is actually serious about this. This was fascinating to me because it was almost like Neal just didn't even think that he was in an election. He did so little in terms of campaigning, did so little in terms of advertising, and she spent money on ads for an independent first-time candidate from Sheffield, Massachusetts. And yes, I had to look up where Sheffield was.
Southern Berkshire County.
Yes, yes. But my point is that she utilized a big budget to get some name recognition this time. A lot of TV ads and well-placed TV ads, half-page, front pages in the Reminder and other newspapers. I mean, so I find it interesting that Neal just sort of was. He wasn't as aggressive with her as he was with Alex Morse, for instance. We tried to get a debate going. It didn't happen. She said yes. He wasn't really interested. He did come on and talk about things, which was great. But
is there something to be said, I wonder, about, to your point about him being a bit more aggressive in that campaign with Alex Morse, or even prior to that, maybe with Tahir Amatul Wadud? There were debates for both of those, but they were primaries.
Yeah.
I wonder if he felt more pressure to be more aggressive because it was a primary versus a general. But every YouTube video that I watched in the 5 or 7 days before the election, and I don't watch a ton of YouTube videos, but almost every single one had a Neil ad on the front of it. So we did spend some money on ads. But Nadia Milleron, 37%, about 36, 37% for her as an independent candidate with considerably less money than Richard Neal, with considerably less name recognition than incumbent Richard Neal. I don't know, Tony. That's not too shabby in terms of, one, how much money she spent and how little she was known.
To go from no name recognition at all is a difficult thing to do in a campaign, and it costs a lot of money to make that happen. It's interesting too when you mention, the expenditure. What did she actually spend? I don't think we know just yet, because independent candidate, self-funding largely, and knowing the TV placement business. If I look at her ads, which began around the 4th of July, there's no way that that's $100,000. And I think that's what her OCPF was talking about, or what she was saying, not even on her OCPF, but to media. I've spent 75 of my own, I raised X. That is a lot more than 100,000, what I saw in her advertising, including the front pages, the half pages, and all the local weeklies in Western Massachusetts. I want to say for 5 or 6 weeks running, There was some social media. Neal's campaign was predominantly social media this time around. And we're seeing that become the big thing now because, as you say, there it was. Every time you looked something up, there he was. But also, if he was using an algorithm, if he was using any kind of AI, which is predominantly what we're doing now, you've got 10 and 15-second messages out there, but they're going exactly where I need them to go, where I know who the voter is, I know they're my voter, and I just have to remind them, if I'm Richie Neal, here's what I did on Social Security, and by the way, whether I'm the chairman of Ways and Means or the ranking member, I bring it back to the district. That was the other thing too. Something I appreciated that you said, Mike, is the campaign style of Neal this time was so different. He was so laid back, so unworried it seemed, but he kept doing all the other things that he always does. And I see this with the amount of time that we've spent in Washington. Neal is somewhat unique in this day and age, and so is McGovern. They come home every weekend. You'll see them from Friday to Monday or when they got to get back on the plane, but they go to everything. If it's not that you're seeing them at an event where they're handing out a check, they're bringing money back home, they're at something. They're actually doing something, and that's pretty neat. So he did do that.
And that's free advertising, in a sense.
It is.
Because that's the power of being an incumbent, right?
Yeah.
Whether you're talking about East-West Rail, you're talking about, in McGovern's case, the need to be raising money for hunger and food awareness. These issues that we've seen them hammer home again and again and again, and they've built a following and obviously built name recognition as a result of their support for those, picking those two issues among many. But Milleron's playbook, I think, is one that we saw with Alex Morse and we saw with Tahira Amatu-Waladud as well, the two previous challengers. She's concerned about the amount of money that he's taking from political action committees. And she also hammered him, as the two previous have as well, about not being in the district enough. So interesting for you to say that, they're home every weekend. The perspective, and perhaps this is a very Western Mass, you live in Berkshire County, versus you live in Springfield, and how often are you seeing Congressman Neal in and around the Springfield area versus how often are you seeing him making it all the way out to the Berkshires? So it could be a perception issue. It'll be interesting to watch.
A perception issue that sometimes could be maybe impacted now by coverage, as we're starting to see less and less media able to cover things, So I know there's been a lot of things I'm aware of that he would be at, or that a Senator Vilas or Senator Gomez, and there's no coverage. And it's not because there isn't a want to do it by the media outlet.
There's not people in the newsroom
to
get there.
Yeah, and they've got to pick and choose, and they've got so many other things. What's hot? What do I have to cover? What do the viewer or reader, want to hear about and see?
One other thing I saw from the Milleron campaign, I'm an unenrolled voter. The text messages from the Milleron camp I'm Nadia Miller on just even stating case statement.
Yeah.
This is who I am, I'm running. This is who I am, I'm running. Remember, get out there and vote. So she certainly spent money on that as well.
Yeah, yeah.
The interesting thing to me is that, and I'll be curious to see what you guys' reaction is. When I hear the word independent in 2024, I tend to think of someone who's left-leaning. And maybe that's because we're in New England and we all know Bernie Sanders. He is an independent. He is certainly left-leaning. I don't think she's left-leaning. You know, her husband's involved with a conservative think tank that produced one of the chapters in Project 2025. Now, she went on record saying that 2025 was toxic, but at the same time, I just get the sense that some of the issues and topics that you normally would associate with what we think of as an independent, she wasn't part of that. And I think she chose her battles very carefully. You know, she had these TV commercials. There was the one with people in a grocery store and talking about high food prices. And then there was the one with all these people wearing their hospital johnnies with their rear ends hanging out, right? And that was to talk about lack of coverage in health.
These what I miss not being an appointment television viewer? I didn't see any of this stuff, Mike.
Well, you see, I still watch locally produced TV news, so I see this stuff. I am one of those dinosaurs that still, you know, other than that, it's all streaming, baby. You know, that's the way it works. But my point is, number one, the commercials were well done. And number two, they covered two of the things that are of great interest, which is, of course, our struggling healthcare situation in the United States and rising food costs. But I didn't ever hear her come out on reproductive rights, by the way. So I don't know how she stood or stands on that issue. I thought she was a very interesting candidate, but again, I wondered when I look at this, so she took Southwick, Wales, Sheffield, Sandusfield, and Tolland. That's communities she won. And glomming into the next race, when I look at the towns that Deaton won, there seems to be this trend that smaller communities in Massachusetts are willing to vote for someone other than a Democrat. That's where the Republican support is. That's where the interest in making a change is. Now, she couldn't make a change, unfortunately, and no offense to the folks in Southwick, Wales, Sheffield, Sandusfield, or Tolland, but the bottom line is then if we go to the Senate race with Warren and Deaton, I mean, Deaton was taking towns, smaller communities, like Granby, Southampton, Southwick, Wilbraham, East Longmeadow. Those are sort of givens for a Republican take, Wilbraham and East Longmeadow.
I was looking at the vote totals that Deaton scored, right, versus how Jeff Deal did when he ran against Warren. And what I found was Deaton did about 4 percentage points better than Jeff Deal did. Jeff Deal said he was a Trump supporter, worked on a portion of the Trump campaign. There was a little bit of back and forth on how involved he actually was, whether he riding Trump's coattails, et cetera, et cetera. But so 36% of the vote for Deal running against Senator Warren versus 40% Deaton, a Republican, a newcomer to Massachusetts. He moved here in February. And one of the Republican supporters who I spoke with here in Western Massachusetts who voted for Trump did not vote for Deaton. She said she felt like he was a Republican in name only. She was frustrated that he did not support President Trump. She sat that race out. She voted for Milleron when she cast her ballot in the Neil Milleron race because she felt like the independent voice challenging Neil was something that she wanted to put her support behind. So that I think gets to your question a bit, Mike, about independent. Does that automatically mean left-leaning? I don't think it does for all people. Susanna Whips would probably have something to say about that, right? Former Republican, who's an unenrolled person now. So I think it'll be interesting to watch whether Deaton runs again It's a long cycle for the Senate, right? So we have 6 years to wait to decide, barring a special election. Elizabeth Warren has said during the debate here in Western Massachusetts, she's in it for the 6 years. She's she's running for Senate. She will stay in the Senate. I don't think the Trump administration will be eager to tap her for any positions. I think the question was, aimed toward whether or not it was a Harris administration, but that now we have, will we see Elizabeth Warren step up to try and make another presidential run?
Well, the other communities that Deaton took, Westfield, which is to be expected, Agawam, West Springfield, Warren was basically her constituents, her supporters, was Pittsfield, Springfield, Worcester, Boston, Holyoke, Greenfield. So larger communities tend to support Warren, smaller communities tended to support Deaton. The debate that NEPM staged, which was the only debate for this particular race that we could see out here, Deaton made a remark about that even though he's running as a Republican, he's an independent spirit, and that he would be in demand in the Senate because, both sides would be going for him. He envisioned a role as, like a tiebreaker type thing. I didn't get a chance to interview him or talk to him. I was sort of surprised by that statement. Does he understand that if he was elected, he'd get the smallest office, he'd get no respect? Because that's the way legislatures work. The incoming people, the newbies, have to earn their chops, and they're not going to play a role as decision makers, basically. Yeah. To just go on what you said, Carrie, I'm willing to bet you a beverage of your choice that in 6 years, there's not going to be Deaton in a race. I really don't think so. What always amazes me about these Republican-Democratic races in Massachusetts is so often the Republicans are people who aim really, really high. Yeah. And they don't have any of that getting your chops, like being on a select board or being on a city council.
He had held no political office prior.
Or anything like that. Now, I know this is America and you don't have to hold a political office. I get it and I embrace that. But on the other hand,
Warren.
Right. Yeah. But at the same time,
she beat Scott Brown, yeah.
I think it's helpful to understand how government works. And city councilors who now must grapple in communities like ours about budget issues where there's federal monies coming in and how are those monies spent. That's like a real issue. That's real training for how government actually works. So I'm always surprised when, and somebody has told me, well, the Republicans don't have a way to make a bench. They don't have a way to put people through government. So now you have experienced people with some name recognition and perhaps a base of support to move forward to things like the Senate or to Congress or to governor. But I'll make you a bet, Carrie.
That's good. Good bet.
You can have the drink too.
Yeah.
Set a reminder in my phone for 6 years from now.
Right.
Make Dobbs make good on his bet. Done and done.
I love it.
But I just found it. I found his ads interesting because he had that, picture of him and Charlie Baker, and it's like, I don't know what context that was taken in. Yeah. I don't know if the two actually know each other. Yeah. I don't know if it was at a Baker fundraiser and you get the ubiquitous picture with the candidate. I don't. It's nice to toss out his name. I had to admit, when I see this, I wonder, hey, does Charlie Baker know his picture is being used in this manner? Honestly, he's with the NCAA right now, so making the big money. Yeah. So let's go to ballot questions. Oh boy,
there you go.
We've touched on it. Let's talk a little bit more. And Carrie, you mentioned, and it's absolutely true, about 71.6% of the electorate is giving the state auditor their approval to audit the House. Now, Professor Gerald Duquette, who's a very, very smart political scientist, was talking about that from a constitutional point of view, this power doesn't exist for the auditor. But it certainly was sort of like red meat for the electorate, obviously, that they embrace the idea that, and you guys have already talked about this, but do we need somebody to do an audit, and what is that audit like? Because that's what is my question. What are we going to be looking at? Are we looking at the operating budget of the general court? Are we looking at individual legislators? How are they spending their money? I don't know. Do you guys know? Because I have not seen anything that
I don't have clarity on that as of yet, but certainly the voters are interested in whatever shape that whatever shape and size and particular flavor that has. But we saw the House Speaker and the Senate Leader Spilka come out and say they wouldn't rule out, they told State House News, they wouldn't rule out the possibility of repealing this. So whether this even goes much farther, we'll have to wait and see. I also will be watching with great interest as to whether or not this goes the way of, what was it, clean elections in 1998. They slow-walked it, the legislature slow-walked it for 5 years, and then poof, it was gone. And that is within the legislature's right.
People forget that these ballot questions are suggestions. It's not like we're passing a referendum that is indeed law, because it's not law yet.
That's what's interesting on these ones. All 5 read binding. So in other states, that means binding. In this state, it's supposed to mean binding. But to your point, I remember term limits voted for overwhelmingly by the people of Massachusetts. And I remember I was sitting in the House gallery the first day of the session, and Speaker Finneran was the House Speaker at that time. Gets up, and everybody's doing the old, ain't it great, we're back, and who got elected, re-elected, all that, great. So I'm thinking, here we go. We're going to see this agenda start to move forward. Speaker got up, and he moved, if I recall correctly, it was House Bill 1, which I'm used to that being a budget or something large. And if I recall correctly, the first order of business, I do recall correctly, the first order of business, he brought up, well, the people voted for term limits, blah, 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 blah. I hear a motion on, blah, blah, blah. Bang, gavel goes down. There were no term limits. It was dealt with that quickly in the House of Representatives. It didn't exist. There was a scream for a day or two, and then other things come up. When people in Massachusetts have to worry about real things like, you know, the cost of groceries, et cetera. Then, now, exactly. And it went away. And all that money, all that time, all that energy spent to pass it. And to Carrie's point, we've heard the Speaker and the Senate President say not just on that one, but maybe in all others, don't worry, because in our infinite wisdom, maybe we'll take a look at it finally, which also brings up the other piece.
We chose not to the first one at the bat.
I love you. There you go. Why didn't you do it? Is this not the job of the legislature? On all 5 questions, no less.
Yes.
But let's kick the can. And that psychedelics thing, I don't want to anger lobbyists A, B, and C who are pals who are for it or against it. Send it to back. What does it also do? If you're in my business, we're ecstatic to see these ballot questions.
Why?
And sometimes, what? Money. Cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. What was the biggest source of revenue for TV stations, for folks in the media, and for folks like myself? The ballot questions.
Yeah, ads.
8 figures that we're aware of right now on question 2, just on the yes side. Wow. 8 figures. Holy smokes. Wow, that's a lot of dough.
Well,
Follow the money.
Next up, MCAS. 59.1% wants to get rid of MCAS. I will admit, folks, I voted against it. And the reason I voted against it is that I didn't see a substitution for it. You know, you get rid of this, and I understand how twisted this is. I understand there's a lot of kids don't do well on standardized tests. I understand, and I'm sympathetic to teachers who feel that they're not getting the right curriculum to the students because they have to cover the test stuff. I get all that. My concern was that I didn't hear what was suggested to take the place. How do we make sure that the kid graduating from high school can do the math that he or she needs to do, can read at a level that's proficient for a high school graduate. What do we do to make sure that these kids don't fall through the cracks that existed before MCAS? And there are people who argue that they still exist with MCAS. It's just different cracks because different kids are falling through them. But obviously, people want to get rid of it. Again, do you think the legislature is going to go along with that? Or do we, because it's a pretty big issue that affects people on a personal level.
I'll give the simple political insider answer. If I'm a member of the House or the Senate in Massachusetts, I'm not going to take on the Massachusetts Teachers Association. The MTA was for a yes. The MTA is 8 figures on this. And I'll say, one of the most powerful lobbies in Massachusetts right now is the MTA. If you're a legislator and you're with the MTA on their issues, you're going to expect in a race 3, 4 mailings if you're challenged, 1 or 2 if you're not, being done for you by the MTA. And there's a superstructure within the MTA of incredible organization, astonishing. There are 40 Senate districts, 40 senators in Massachusetts. Each one of those districts has a person charged with all grassroots, all activity for the MTA. So there are 40 of these folks, and under those 40, there's armies, massive grassroots armies who come out to vote. Teachers vote. So my gut, I don't think the legislature is going to mess with this one.
To your point about the what's next, and I missed this.
The piece.
I missed this in the first time around, but the head of, it's on my notes here, the state senator, Jason Lewis, he's the chair of the education committee. In the fall, he came out and said, I'm voting yes, I'm going with the MTA, and I'm going to push come January for MassCore. Now those are they were passed in 2008. They're suggestions for what curriculum should be included, what benchmarks there should be. They are not required, but they are recommended. He's saying he'll come out in January and say, now it doesn't need to be a test, it doesn't need to be a requirement for graduation, but these are the competencies that we want to see our children, these are the benchmarks that we want to see our kids meeting and making moving forward. So Jason Lewis has your answer.
Okay.
We'll see if it happens.
That was great,
We'll see if it happens.
Rideshare drivers, their ability to unionize came in at 53.8% yes, so they won that. I thought it was a little bit odd that this was on the ballot. I was trying to remember the last time we voted on a group of workers to have the ability to unionize. And so I was a little confused about that. But they're
right. They're gig economy workers. It's the wild, wild west, I think, you know?
Well said.
And Tufts came out with, the Tufts Center for State Policy Analysis came out with its pre-election primer. I love reading through that. I always learn so much from it. And they pointed out that if this passes, as it did, they expect a challenge, a legal challenge to it, because if Massachusetts finds a way for these gig workers, these rideshare workers to unionize, well, then other states might also find a way. Seattle tried it, right? But there was pushback. Massachusetts, there was talk that they sort of used that Seattle legislation to be a roadmap for this time around. Massachusetts shored up some of those leaky spots that Seattle tested for them. We'll see if that legal challenge actually comes to bear. Short of the legal challenge, Tufts pointed out, you know, there are a couple things that the legislature could do to make it a little more bulletproof. You know, among those, ensure that regional nonprofit entities providing transit, like the Franklin Regional Transit Authority, you know, your senior vans, right? Whether or not those would then be subject to these union restrictions or not. Because that, I guess, is an open question as part of this.
Exactly,
I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with this one. Shrooms. You know, there is so much documentation about how using mushrooms, microdosing mushrooms for particular PTSD and other issues is successful. 57.1% said no, and there were some TV ads that were very pointed with a number of physicians and different from different areas, fearing that this was going to open up basically a Pandora's box of, hey, I'm growing them at home and I'm going to sell them to you. And it had little to do with health reasons and everything to do with getting high. And apparently the voters agreed with that idea.
I think it was too much too soon.
Yeah.
We saw the legalization of marijuana. It was very measured. We saw medicinal marijuana. Then we saw recreational marijuana. The legislature took its time in rolling out the nitty-gritty. We're still trying to fix how the legislation works and where it hasn't been effective. It's been horrible when it comes to social justice and equity. That was supposed to be a huge part of that law.
We could do a whole nother show.
You've done great work on that. I just want to, unbelievable coverage, yeah.
So I think for folks, to your point, Mike, right, we've seen a lot of research about the impact on depression, PTSD, the positive impacts of the use of these substances, but there were physicians who believe in the use of this as medicine, who thought that this was a bad idea because they thought, in one instance, the way that it would open up access to Ibogaine, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, that there could be some real complications for folks if they misused it. And I think fears, perhaps, or the questions of benefit versus deterrent, I think obviously that won the day here, maybe.
And politics is perception. And something that we saw in some polling was, to your point, folks in favor of marijuana legalization and then watching the state muck it up, the mistakes, the Cannabis Commission, all over the place, the issues, the problems, and turmoil internally and all that, but also understanding that, to your point, the social equity aspect, all that it was put together to do.
That's the whole point of it, right?
You. Exactly. The sell point of it was that. But instead, so many corporate owners, I might be off on this, but I think there are only 6 truly minority-owned, women-owned retailers.
Very few. One here in Springfield.
One in Springfield, Six Bricks. Peyton Schubrick, who I think's been on and talked about some of the issues. So the other thing, though, too, on psychedelics was the other perception aspect of it. And I'm old, so every time I heard about this thing, I kept thinking, Jefferson Starship. One pill makes you smaller, one pill makes you bigger. And of course, I'm a classical high school graduate, one of the last, right? And Timothy Leary went to classical high school, the LSD guy, you know? So I was like, yeah, I could see this. But then the average regular person, whoa, what does this do? How dangerous does this make someone drive? It just wasn't well presented, well thought out. And you're right, there were just too many questions. And when in doubt, people don't vote yes, they vote no.
I do think it'll be interesting now to watch. Obviously, we can't get another crack at this as a ballot question for 6 years? I think that's the law, right? But what this does to decriminalization. We've seen Cambridge, we've seen Northampton, I think Amherst as well, decriminalize the use of these substances. And whether we now see, because this failed at the state level, whether we're going to see other communities maybe taking this on as a perhaps intermediary step to go there. Obviously, we've seen Colorado and Oregon. They're ready to go when it comes to psychedelics, and as they were with marijuana, and then Massachusetts followed with marijuana. So I don't think it's done. I just think it needs to be a slower process, perhaps.
And perhaps the goal, if we want to have this stuff, is to have a bill in the legislature that spells out who's going to produce it, how is it going to be produced, who's going to be able to have it, et cetera, et cetera. And considering the time that they took with cannabis, it probably take another 6 years, honestly, because I think cannabis was at least something that people understood a little bit more about than the use of natural psychedelics. The minimum, last but certainly not least, the minimum wage for tipped workers, 64.4% no. So my wife was a waitress. I was a bartender. I understand.
Tables forever.
Okay, so you understand. You get that itty bitty check from your boss, and it's really up to you through luck and hustle to get a decent night's wage, and that's through tipping, and it is through luck and hustle. Let's face it. There are people who do make a living being a server, and if they're in a good spot, a good restaurant that meets it's a good marriage, so to speak, they can have a decent wage out of this. But this would have really upturned that apple cart in a very big way. And I think it's interesting that voters recognize that.
This to me was confusing as confusing could get.
Yeah.
Because I was a server for a long time, and then I was a caterer for a long time, so obviously tips weren't as big of a part of that. I was thinking, if I was still a server, would I like this or not? Because Mike, as you say, you could hustle and you could have a great night.
Yep.
But I was also thinking about back to when I was working as a server through college, and then after that, as I became a journalist, a lot of that money was cash.
Yeah.
Cash money. It wasn't coming on a credit card shit that was automatically reported to the government. And I'm not saying I didn't always report my cash tips, but nobody reports their cash tips.
Beyond the statute of limitations here, Carrie.
Okay, you're covered.
The 7-year look back, we're good, right?
Yeah.
Nobody reports their cash tips. But that's not a huge part of this industry anymore. But there were people who were servers who were for this, servers who were against this. I don't think it was clear cut to people whether or not this was a good idea or a bad idea. I think it was confusing in that, okay, you're going to earn minimum wage if this had passed. You're going to earn minimum wage and still earn tips on top of that. And I wonder if that rubbed people the wrong way. Because they're thinking, oh, wait, you're earning minimum wage and I'm going to give you something additional on top of that?
But of course, minimum wage isn't very much.
And not a livable wage.
Exactly. But I understand what you're saying. And the other thing that was brought up was that if restaurants had to start paying a minimum wage to servers, bartenders, they're going to cut people or they're going to raise prices. They're
going to be an app. You're not going to have a server anymore. You're just going to click on a phone.
Yeah. And it's the small restaurant owners, the one-stop shops, that would get hurt the most. The big restaurant associate, the Massachusetts Restaurant Association, the chains, they were on the other side of this, But the folks that we all know, whether it be Nadim, right down the road from where we are right now, or Nabil out in West Springfield, Westfield, shortstop, those folks who really push it hard and are trying to keep their menu items affordable. I actually had one small restaurant owner say to me, Tony, I'm fighting to keep away from a $20 hamburger with all my other costs right now, right? I want to do more for my folks, but I can't. This is the end. If this goes, I've got to think, what do I do? I'm not a chain. I'm not Applebee's. I'm not, one of the big, I'm not Olive Garden, etc. Yeah, wow.
So now, in our waning moments, we got the big one. The macro.
Nobody else talked about it.
Yeah, we got it covered. We're all good. We're good.
We got the macro of macros here, which is the presidential race. And, the Bay State, 61.3% for Harris, Trump, 36.5%. I follow a guy named Ted Rall, R-A-L-L. In fact, I've met Ted. He's a cartoonist. He's a political commentator. He wrote a great graphic novel a few years ago about his trips to the Stan countries like Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, based on the premise that most of us, me included, know extremely little about these nations, what they are. It was a great book. Well, Ted came out and said, hey, you don't have to vote for Harris and you don't have to vote for Trump. If you don't like them, let's send a message, vote for the Libertarian, vote for the Green Party. And so when I was looking at the stats, Jill Stein, the perennial Green Party presidential candidate, 0.8% in quote-unquote liberal progressive Massachusetts. The bottom line is there were two choices. I don't care who else was on the ballot. There were two choices. And Trump won. Harris did not. And now there's all of this talk, which I'd like you guys to comment about. Does the Democratic Party need to reinvent itself? Has the Democratic Party come away from its roots and its base constituencies, unions, minorities, people who are seeking social justice? Did Harris not reflect enough of those values? And I'm wondering, because everybody is trying to do this Monday night quarterbacking, what you guys thought.
The answers now because the dust has settled.
I mean, personally, I thought Harris did a remarkable job in the short length of time that she had. I also will say, I think that Biden made a complete mistake of even thinking he should run again. Mm-hmm. I think that basically we thought that he was a bridge president. He was going to build a bridge for another Democratic candidate to come in. Biden did a lot of stuff that the country needed to get back on its feet. And let's face it, we have the best GNP in the world. We've got an incredibly low jobless rate. We've got stock markets that have been making money for all of our 401ks. There's been a lot of progress made. But all of this didn't translate into enough votes. And I'm really concerned about it because I really don't understand it all that much. So I ask smart people.
I'll let Tony take the Democrats' question as the stated unenrolled.
And I'll try to be succinct because there's some great points to this whole piece. Do the Democrats need to reinvent? Not so much reinvent, but they've got to completely change the ground game. And they've got to do something that the Republicans, I take it back, that the MAGA Republican Trump campaign and the mega PACs that supported Donald Trump. I see 937 PACs on my quick count that were pro-Trump. I see 117 that were pro-Harris. I see Elon Musk, quick, straight to the point, and not just my opinion, but finally the New York Times, just before the election. Wow, 40 billionaires got together in a room, called together by Peter Thiel. Everybody's there, all the players. Musk comes, they lay out the game plan. He might be crazy, he might be nuts, but guess what this does for our businesses, what it does for us. So the 40 big billionaire business players become the 40 ugliarchs. Musk says, I'll come in around 4th of July, but I want to be quiet. Trump, attempted shooting. For some reason it affected Musk. He jumps in. At this moment, no one knows how much money was actually spent by Elon Musk. I'll take a shot and say it's just shy of $300 million for sure. Wow. And not only does Elon Musk come in and spend that amount of money, he does it brilliantly. Algorithms, AI, and he owns
$1 million a day.
Which, I don't know, guys. I would have gone to jail. It is illegal. There's no question. I love you, Mike. I can't do it. You can't pay for a vote. My God, I'm watching all this. All the rules are changed is the point that I'm running to right now. And the Democrats have to change one thing, that they haven't changed anything from 2000 to 2024 when it comes down to how to play the rock'em sock'em game. I remember the recount, 2000. Grab the movie, recount. You see a point in there where Michael Hooley, played by Dennis Leary, says to Warren Christopher, I love you, I revere you, but you better start playing the game that James Baker's playing on the other side. Because those are the rules, not these nice guy, nice people rules that the world is watching. We're in a new game right now. When a Musk can step in, do this, and no one stopped him. Merrick Garland, did you go on vacation this year? What the heck happened there? And that's a 5-hour topic, right? But all this stuff to play. Would the Republicans have played all of this differently if the Democrats had a candidate like a Donald Trump? Absolutely, absolutely. So to point, this is a different ball game now, and the Democrats have to take a look at that. 40 billionaires spent how much money on this campaign, and it's all because of Citizens United allowing them to do that. The world changed then. First year that I worked for PACs, it's taken me this long to get over the ethical concept in my mind, that my hatred of Citizens United. If Antonin Scalia, who was for it, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg were to walk in here right now, the two most unlikely, improbable members of the court to be friends, both on opposite, they would be shocked by what United actually has produced, that it produced this. So that's what the Democrats have to take a look at. It's nice in the trenches. It's nice with the grassroots. It's nice that we have to, or that Democrats have to, because I'm unenrolled as well, that Democrats have to dot all the boxes, say all the right things. You can't get elected with that. Front page today, Boston Globe. I'm quoted in it, I don't know how, but Seth Moulton on the transgender thing. Whether he's right, whether he's wrong, at least there's a discussion right now saying, was this the right piece to play? Apparently, Trump's campaign thought so. They spent about $30 million on the one issue and got everybody to focus on that, the shiny object. Let me make you crazy about transgender people. Gosh golly gee whiz. And the PAC spent about another $50 million on that. And it made you forget all the rest. You know, it's wild. We're in a new game of perception.
Especially, what's our percentage of population who identify as transgender?
Very small, 1 point something, I think, nationally, yeah.
Isn't it not even a full percentage?
I don't think so. I was going to say, is it 0.7 or something? I should know, and I don't know. I'm embarrassed, but it's very small, yeah.
They took a subject and
it made it huge.
And diverted attention from other things that were far more important.
Mike, and forgive me if I'm hogging too much time right now. I remember, and I think I may have said this with you privately in the past, 1988, Joe Biden probably plagiarizes 3 sentences from an Irish prime minister's candidate. And he has to get out of the race. And over that, you take a look at whether you love him or you hate him, what Donald Trump has done, or the actions or the activities, the shenanigans, yada, yada. It's astonishing. We're in a whole new ballgame. And I don't think the Democrats really realize that. You could not shame this guy, attack this guy, go after him. You weren't. You had to do this a different way.
For me, though, I think what I keep going back to is that democracy worked.
Yeah.
Donald Trump talked about in the lead up to the election how the Democrats were going to cheat and the lawyers were on standby and we expected very low lines. We expected a ton of dysfunction. I mean, Boston had some of its challenges with the ballots, right, that had to be rushed to that area. But I think it seems like there's a handle on what happened there. There were some lines. There wasn't a lot of dysfunction, which had been one of the big things that the Trump campaign had been putting front and center, and the legal challenges that would come. At the end of the day, we know who the victor is. Not everyone might be excited about that, but there is 50% of the country that is overjoyed that this has transpired. And for some of the MAGA supporters who we spoke with at NEPM in this region, they really talked about, I was really struck by how the way that they talked about Donald Trump was as if it was someone that they had over to their couch to hang out with. Here's this guy who's on the world's wealthiest list, but he understood what these people were facing: the cost of bread, the cost of eggs, the cost of milk, the impact of a fixed budget. This resonated with these folks. We'll see where it goes from here.
Carrie, Tony, thanks so much for coming in. And I'm sure that we can continue this conversation. Maybe we should do it in about 6 or 8 months when we actually know what the first year of the new Trump administration is like.
There you go. Wow.
And folks, thank you very much for watching Government Matters here on Focus Springfield.